The desert doesn't lie about what it takes. Ayana learned this truth when her own people turned their backs, when whispers of cursed followed her footsteps like vultures circling carrion. They said the Apache girl was cursed, but the cowboy held her and whispered, "You're home now." In that moment, beneath the merciless New Mexico sun, two broken souls discovered that sometimes salvation comes not from the gods, but from the trembling hands of a stranger who refuses to believe in curses. The desert had taken everything from them both, but it could not steal this, the fierce tenderness that blooms only in the wasteland of the heart. The sun carved shadows into the red earth like scars that would never heal, and Ayana walked among them as if she belonged to the darkness itself. Her bare feet had learned the language of thorns and stones, each step a prayer to ancestors who no longer answered her calls. The Apache girl moved through the desert like smoke, insubstantial and unwanted, carrying the weight of a curse she had never asked for and could not understand. Behind her, miles of emptiness stretched toward the mountains where her people lived and breathed and forgot her name with each passing day. The wind carried no comfort, only the endless whisper of sand against sand, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her exile. She had been 17 summers when the sickness came to their camp, when children began to wither like flowers in drought, and the elders searched for someone to blame. Ayana remembered the moment their eyes found her, the way suspicion crystallized into certainty with the cruel efficiency of winter frost. She had been different, always different, too quiet, too thoughtful, too willing to wander alone among the sacred places where spirits were said to dwell. When the fever took 3 children in one night, the medicine man pointed his gnarled finger at her heart and spoke the word that would follow her into the wasteland: cursed. The sound of it still echoed in her bones, a drumbeat of condemnation that no amount of distance could silence. Now she walked the borderlands between worlds, neither Apache nor white, neither living nor truly dead. The desert had become her only companion, its harsh beauty a mirror for the desolation in her soul. She spoke to the coyotes in the language of loneliness, shared her meager water with the dying plants, and watched the stars wheel overhead like distant campfires of a tribe that would never welcome her home. Each dawn brought the same choice: continue walking or surrender to the sand, and let the desert claim what everyone else had already discarded. But something in her refused to yield, some stubborn spark that insisted she was more than the sum of their fears. The trading post at Esperanza appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its weathered adobe walls shimmering in the heat. Ayana had avoided such places for months, knowing that white men's superstitions could be as deadly as Apache ones. But hunger had become a living thing inside her, gnawing at her strength with relentless teeth. She approached with the caution of a wild animal, every sense alert for the first sign of hostility or fear. The few people she glimpsed moved with the purposeful urgency of those who had learned to survive in hard country, their faces carved by wind and worry into masks of grim determination. She waited until the sun reached its zenith, when the heat would drive most people indoors, before creeping close enough to search for scraps behind the building. Her fingers found nothing but dust and broken glass, the remnants of other desperate souls who had passed this way before her. The disappointment settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold despite the blazing temperature. She was turning to leave when she heard the voice, low and steady as distant thunder, speaking words that would change the direction of her wandering forever. "You look like you could use some water, miss." The cowboy stood in the doorway of the trading post, his hat tilted against the glare, and Ayana felt something shift in the air between them. Not fear, not disgust, but something she had almost forgotten existed in the world of men. Ethan Moore had seen enough broken things in his 36 years to recognize the particular way a soul could shatter while still drawing breath. The Apache girl stood frozen in the alley behind Martinez's trading post, like a deer caught between predator and precipice, her dark eyes holding depths of wariness that spoke of betrayals too numerous to count. Her clothes hung on her thin frame like borrowed shadows, and the careful way she held herself told him everything he needed to know about the kind of welcome she expected from the world. He had been loading supplies for the long ride back to his ranch when he spotted her, and something in her desperate dignity had stopped him cold. "I don't mean any harm," he said, keeping his voice soft and his hands visible the way he might approach a wounded animal. "Just thought you might be thirsty." He pulled his canteen from his belt and set it on the ground between them, then stepped back to give her space to decide. The girl's eyes darted from the water to his face and back again, calculating risks with the swift precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading the intentions of strangers. Ethan waited, patient as stone, while the desert heat pressed down on them both like the weight of unspoken prayers. She moved toward the canteen with liquid grace, never taking her eyes off him, and when she lifted it to her lips, he saw her hands tremble with more than just weakness. The water disappeared quickly, and she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, before setting the canteen down with careful reverence. "Gracias," she whispered, the word barely audible above the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings. Her voice carried the musical cadence of her people, but underneath it lay something else, a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of months spent running from ghosts that lived in other people's minds. "You got a name?" Ethan asked, crouching down to retrieve his canteen, moving slowly so as not to startle her. The girl hesitated, and he could see the war playing out behind her eyes. The desire for human connection battling against the hard-learned wisdom that names could become weapons in the wrong hands. "Mine's Ethan," he offered, hoping to tip the scales toward trust. "Ethan Moore. I run cattle about 20 miles north of here." The information hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn, and he found himself holding his breath while she made her decision. "Ayana," she said finally, the name falling from her lips like a prayer offered to an uncertain god. "It means eternal blossom in my language, though I think the spirits must have been laughing when they gave it to me." The bitterness in her voice cut through the desert air like a blade, and Ethan felt something twist in his chest at the casual way she dismissed her own worth. He had heard the stories that drifted through the territory like tumbleweeds, whispers of an Apache girl who brought death wherever she walked, a young woman cursed by her own people and cast out to wander the wasteland alone. Looking at her now, seeing the intelligence in her dark eyes and the quiet strength in the way she carried herself, despite obvious hunger and exhaustion, Ethan felt a familiar anger kindle in his belly. It was the same rage that had driven him to leave his father's plantation in Georgia, the same disgust with humanity's endless capacity for cruelty disguised as righteousness. "Well, Ayana," he said, standing and dusting off his knees, "I don't know much about curses, but I know something about being hungry and alone. My ranch isn't much to look at, but there's food and a roof that doesn't leak too bad. You're welcome to both if you want them." The offer hung in the shimmering air between them like a lifeline thrown across an impossible chasm, and Ayana stared at him as if he had just offered to lasso the moon and pull it down from the sky for her personal use. The journey to Ethan's ranch stretched across 3 days of desert silence, where the only sounds were the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional creak of leather saddles adjusting to the weight of 2 souls carrying more than their bodies could bear. Ayana rode behind him on the same horse, her small frame pressed against his back, not from choice but from necessity, and Ethan could feel the tension in her muscles like a bowstring pulled too tight, ready to snap at the first sign of betrayal. She had not spoken since accepting his offer, and he wondered if the curse the townspeople whispered about had stolen her voice along with her place in the world. The sun beat down mercilessly on the red earth, painting everything in shades of rust and abandonment, and Ethan found himself thinking about the stories his grandmother used to tell about lost spirits wandering the desert, searching for a home that no longer existed. When they stopped to rest the horse near a dried creek bed, Ayana slipped down from the saddle like water finding its way through cracks in stone, and she moved to the far edge of their makeshift camp, sitting with her back to him, as if even his kindness might be contaminated by her presence. The silence between them was not comfortable but necessary, like the space between lightning and thunder, and Ethan respected it, even as it carved hollows in his chest. The second day brought clouds that promised rain, but delivered only the mockery of shadows racing across the barren landscape, and Ayana finally spoke, her voice so soft that Ethan had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Why?" she asked, and the single word carried the weight of every rejection she had ever endured, every door that had been slammed in her face, every campfire that had been extinguished at her approach. Ethan considered his answer carefully, knowing that words spoken in the desert had a way of echoing long after they were uttered, and he finally said, "Because everyone deserves a place to rest their head without fear." She turned to look at him then, and her eyes held depths that reminded him of the old wells on his property, dark and mysterious and possibly bottomless. And he saw in them not the curse that others feared, but the accumulated pain of a young woman who had been carrying the weight of other people's superstitions since before she understood what they meant. The horse beneath them seemed to sense the shift in the air, stepping more carefully, as if navigating not just the rocky terrain, but the fragile trust beginning to form between its riders. When night fell, they made camp under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, and for the first time since he had found her, Ayana allowed herself to sleep without one eye open, though she still positioned herself far enough away that she could run if the need arose. The third morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of light that made everything look newly created, and Ethan's ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage that refused to disappear when they drew closer. It was not much to look at. A modest house built from adobe and hope, a barn that had seen better decades, and corrals that held more memories than livestock. But to Ethan, it represented everything he had worked for since leaving his father's farm in Missouri. Ayana studied the approaching buildings with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail in case she needed to find her way back in the dark, and Ethan could see her calculating distances, noting escape routes, preparing for the inevitable moment when this sanctuary would also reject her. The ranch hands who worked for him, old Miguel with his weathered face and knowing eyes, and young Tommy who still believed the world was fundamentally fair, emerged from the barn as they approached, and Ethan felt Ayana tense behind him like a deer catching the scent of wolves. He had not told his men about his decision to bring her here, and he could see the questions forming in their expressions as they took in the sight of the Apache girl who had been the subject of so much fearful gossip in the surrounding towns. Miguel's face remained carefully neutral, but Tommy's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been fear, and Ethan knew that the real test of his decision was just beginning. "This is Ayana," Ethan announced as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who would not tolerate argument, and he reached up to help her down from the horse with a gentleness that surprised even him. She accepted his assistance, but immediately stepped away, positioning herself so that she could see all three men without turning her back on any of them, and the defensive posture broke something small and tender in Ethan's chest. Miguel nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both understanding and acceptance, but Tommy remained frozen in place, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to speak but could not find words adequate to the situation. The silence stretched between them like a rope being tested for its breaking point, and Ethan realized that this moment would define not just Ayana's place on his ranch, but the kind of man he truly was when faced with the choice between comfort and conscience. The wind picked up, stirring dust devils in the yard, and carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility, and Ayanna lifted her chin slightly, meeting each man's gaze with a dignity that had somehow survived every attempt to strip it away. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands, and she said simply, "I will work for my keep," as if expecting nothing more than the chance to earn her place in a world that had never offered her anything freely. The house felt different with Ayanna in it, as if her presence had shifted the very air and made Ethan aware of spaces he had never noticed before. The way afternoon light fell across the kitchen table, the sound his boots made on the wooden floors, the emptiness of rooms that had grown comfortable in their solitude. She moved through his home like a ghost learning to be solid again, touching nothing without permission, speaking only when spoken to, and maintaining a careful distance that seemed measured in more than just feet. Ethan had given her the small room at the back of the house, the one his sister had used during her brief visits before marriage took her to California, and he had watched Ayanna examine it with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to trust in permanence. The bed was simple but clean, the window faced east toward the sunrise, and there was a small wooden cross on the wall that his mother had carved before her death, details that seemed to both comfort and unsettle his unexpected guest. That first evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch and the day's heat began to dissipate, Ethan found himself moving more quietly through his own home, conscious of her presence in a way that was both protective and uncertain. She had accepted his offer of food, but eaten sparingly, as if afraid that taking too much might somehow prove the curse real, and when she thanked him, her words carried the weight of someone who had forgotten what gratitude felt like when it was not mixed with desperation. The night sounds of the ranch seemed amplified with Ayanna sleeping under his roof. The settling of wood, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the eaves. And Ethan lay awake, listening to the silence from her room and wondering if she was doing the same. He had acted on instinct when he brought her here, driven by something deeper than logic or social convention, but now he faced the reality of what his decision meant for both of them. The townspeople would not understand, his neighbors would whisper, and there would be consequences that he could not yet imagine. But as he finally drifted towards sleep, Ethan found himself thinking not about the challenges ahead, but about the way Ayanna had looked when he told her she was home now, as if he had spoken a word in a language she had forgotten she knew. Tomorrow would bring its own tests and trials, but tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, his house felt less like a shelter and more like a home, filled with the quiet breathing of someone who had finally found a place to rest without fear. The curse that others whispered about seemed as distant as the stars outside his window, and Ethan allowed himself to believe that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply offer sanctuary to another soul lost in the wilderness of human cruelty. Dawn arrived at the ranch with the subtlety of a gunshot, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world that harbored so much ugliness. And Ethan woke to find that his first thought was not of the day's work ahead, but of whether Ayanna had slept peacefully in the room down the hall. He dressed quietly, his movements careful and deliberate, and when he emerged from his bedroom, he found her already in the kitchen, standing by the window with her back to him, watching the sunrise with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing it against future darkness. She had braided her long black hair and somehow managed to make her travel-worn dress look presentable, and there was something about her stillness that reminded him of a deer pausing at the edge of a meadow, beautiful and alert and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. "Good morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her, and when she turned to face him, he saw that her eyes held a wariness that sleep had not been able to wash away. She nodded in response, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, and Ethan realized that earning her trust would be like coaxing a wild bird to eat from his hand, requiring patience, consistency, and the willingness to accept that she might fly away at any moment. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove, and he moved to light the fire beneath it, conscious of her watching his every movement, as if trying to decode the intentions behind his actions. The morning routine of the ranch unfolded around them like a familiar dance, with Miguel and Tommy arriving as the sun cleared the horizon, their faces carefully neutral as they acknowledged Ayana's presence with polite nods that revealed nothing of their true feelings. Ethan assigned the day's tasks with his usual efficiency, but he found himself hyper-aware of how his words might sound to someone who had learned to listen for rejection in every conversation. And he made sure to include Ayana in his plans without making her feel singled out or burdensome. The vegetable garden needs weeding, he told her, and the chickens could use someone with a gentle hand to collect their eggs, tasks that would keep her close to the house and away from any visitors who might bring trouble with their gossip and fear. She accepted the work with a dignity that made his chest tight, and as she moved toward the garden with steps that seemed to barely disturb the earth beneath her feet, Ethan caught Miguel watching her with an expression that might have been approval. Tommy remained more skeptical, his young face creased with the worry of someone who had heard too many stories about Apache curses and not enough about Apache humanity. But he kept his concerns to himself and went about his duties with the grudging professionalism that Ethan had come to expect from him. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. And as Ethan watched Ayana kneel among the struggling tomato plants, he felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening after being locked for too long. The work progressed in a rhythm that felt both natural and strange, with Ayana moving through her tasks with an efficiency that spoke of hard-won experience and a desperate desire to prove her worth. She handled the chickens with a gentleness that seemed to calm even the most temperamental hens, and when Ethan checked on her progress, he found the vegetable garden transformed from a patch of weeds and neglect into something that looked like it might actually produce food. Her movements were economical and precise, wasting no motion or energy, and he realized that survival had taught her skills that most people never needed to learn. When the sun reached its zenith and the heat became oppressive, he called for a break, and they gathered in the shade of the barn to share water and the simple meal that Miguel's wife had packed for them. Ayana sat slightly apart from the men, not from rudeness, but from habit, and Ethan found himself studying her profile as she ate, noting the delicate line of her jaw and the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks. There was a beauty in her that had nothing to do with the exotic otherness that some men might fetishize, and everything to do with the quiet strength that radiated from her like heat from a banked fire. Tommy seemed to be warming to her presence, his initial fear giving way to curiosity, and when she smiled at something Miguel said in his mixture of English and Spanish, the transformation of her face was so complete that Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. The afternoon brought visitors in the form of Reverend Patterson and his wife, their buggy raising a cloud of dust that announced their arrival long before they reached the house, and Ethan felt his stomach clench with the knowledge that this moment had been inevitable from the instant he decided to bring Ayana home. The Reverend was a good man in his way, but he carried the weight of his congregation's expectations and fears, and Mrs. Patterson had never met a piece of gossip she couldn't improve with her own embellishments. Ayana seemed to sense the change in atmosphere before the buggy even came into view, and she melted away from the garden like smoke dissipating in the wind, disappearing into the barn with a swiftness that spoke of long practice in making herself invisible. Ethan straightened his shoulders and walked out to meet his visitors, his face carefully composed into an expression of polite welcome that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. "Ethan," the Reverend called out as he climbed down from the buggy, his voice carrying the hearty false cheer of a man preparing to deliver unwelcome news. "We heard the most extraordinary story in town yesterday, and we simply had to come see for ourselves." Mrs. Patterson remained seated, her sharp eyes already scanning the ranch for signs of the Apache girl who had become the subject of so much fearful speculation. And Ethan knew that whatever he said in the next few minutes would determine not just his own reputation, but Ayana's safety as well. The conversation that followed was a delicate dance of words and implications, with the Reverend speaking in careful euphemisms about Christian duty and the dangers of harboring certain elements, while his wife sat in the buggy like a judge waiting to pronounce sentence. Ethan listened with the patience of a man who had learned to read the currents beneath polite conversation, and he responded with measured words that neither confirmed nor denied the rumors that had brought them to his door. "I believe in helping those who need help," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed by social pressure or religious guilt. The Reverend's face flushed slightly at this response, and he began to speak more directly about the unnatural attachment that some men developed for savage women and the corruption of Christian values that such relationships represented. Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously at each point, her bonnet bobbing like a bird pecking at seeds, and Ethan felt his temper begin to rise like mercury in a thermometer placed too close to a flame. When the Reverend finally suggested that the girl would be better served by the mission school in Santa Fe where she could learn proper Christian ways, Ethan's response was swift and final. "She's under my protection now, and that's where she'll stay." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Ethan saw the exact moment when the Reverend realized that persuasion had failed and that sterner measures might be required. After the visitors departed, their buggy wheels churning up dust and disappointment in equal measure, Ethan found Ayana in the barn, sitting in the hayloft with her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them like armor against the world's cruelty. She did not look up when he climbed the ladder to join her, but he could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her breathing had become shallow and quick, as if she were preparing to run or fight, or simply disappear into the shadows that had sheltered her for so long. "They want me gone," she said without preamble, her voice so quiet that he had to lean closer to hear her, and the simple statement carried more pain than any scream could have conveyed. Ethan settled beside her in the hay, careful to maintain enough distance that she would not feel trapped, and he chose his words with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. "What they want doesn't matter," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Because this is my land, and you're under my protection." As she turned to look at him then, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception or doubt, and he met her gaze without flinching, letting her see the truth that he had not yet fully admitted to himself. The silence between them was different now, charged with possibilities and dangers that neither of them fully understood, and when she finally spoke again, her words were barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this for me?" The question hung in the dusty air of the barn like incense, sacred and dangerous, and Ethan realized that his answer would change everything between them, for better or worse, forever. The attack came at dawn, when the desert still held the cool breath of night and the horizon bled pink with promise. Ethan heard the thunder of hooves before he saw the dust cloud, and his heart turned to stone as he recognized the silhouettes of men from town, their rifles glinting like accusations in the early light. They had come for Ayana, and the set of their shoulders told him they hadn't ridden all this way to talk. He stepped onto the porch, his hand resting on his gun, knowing that some battles choose you whether you're ready or not. The morning that had begun with such tender hope now tasted of gunpowder and the bitter certainty that love sometimes demands the ultimate price. Sheriff Coleman dismounted first, his badge catching the sunlight like a star that had fallen and lost its way. "Step aside, Moore," he called, his voice carrying the weight of a town's collective fear and the authority of men who mistake cruelty for justice. "We've come for the Apache girl, and we won't be leaving without her." Behind him, a dozen men shifted in their saddles, their faces hard as the desert stone, their eyes holding the kind of hatred that had been passed down like a family heirloom from father to son. Ethan felt the familiar weight of his colt against his hip, but he also felt something heavier, the knowledge that some stands you take, not because you can win, but because losing while standing is better than living on your knees. The wind picked up, stirring the dust between them like the breath of ghosts, and somewhere behind him he heard Ayana's soft footstep on the wooden floor. "She's under my protection," Ethan said, his voice steady as bedrock, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird, desperate for flight. The words hung in the air between them, simple and final as a gravestone inscription, and he watched as Coleman's face darkened with the kind of anger that comes from having your authority questioned by a man who should know better. The other men murmured among themselves, their voices carrying the ugly music of a mob that had already decided guilt and was now simply going through the motions of justice. Ethan thought of Ayana behind him, probably watching through the window, and he wondered if she could see in his stance the same thing he had seen in her eyes that first day, the terrible courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the heat that would soon make the desert shimmer like a mirage. But for now, the air was clear and sharp, perfect for seeing exactly where each man stood. The standoff stretched like a held breath, each second heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Coleman's hand moved toward his gun, and Ethan saw the moment when talking ended and dying began, saw it in the sheriff's eyes, like watching a door slam shut. But then Ayana stepped onto the porch beside him, her chin raised with the kind of dignity that comes from accepting your fate while refusing to be ashamed of it, and Ethan felt his heart break and swell at the same time. "I will go," she said, her voice carrying across the distance between them like a prayer spoken in a language only the wind understood. The men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps expecting defiance or tears, not this quiet acceptance that made them all feel smaller somehow. Ethan reached for her hand, and when their fingers touched, he felt the electric shock of a connection that transcended the ugly realities of the world around them. "No," Ethan said, the word coming out harder than he intended, carrying with it all the loneliness of his past and all the hope he had found in her presence. He stepped forward, placing himself between Ayana and the mounted men, his body a living shield against the hatred that rode toward them on horseback. "She stays with me, and if you want her, you'll have to go through me first." The declaration hung in the air, like smoke from a gunshot, and he saw Coleman's face cycle through surprise, anger, and finally a grudging respect for a man willing to die for his convictions. Behind him, Ayana made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, and when he glanced back, he saw tears streaming down her face, not tears of fear, but of something far more dangerous and beautiful. The desert wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and Ethan realized that sometimes home isn't a place you find, but a choice you make, even when that choice might be the last one you ever get to make.